a modified Karelian VT-1300 cruiser, a design old enough that, at any other time, it would have been scrapped and replaced. And yet, the Crow had demonstrated a determined reluctance to be scrapped or otherwise replaced. She stared at the ship, eyes narrowing. She had read the reports, seen the gun camera footage from the X-Wings. It couldn't be any other ship, but standing here, with the ship sitting placidly on its landing skids, she still found it hard to believe. And the reports about Kyle, they were almost too fanciful to be believed. Had it been only one person, she could have easily discounted the report. But when nearly every member of Rogue Squadron, including Luke Skywalker, reported the exact same thing, it could only be the truth. Do I not want to believe it? Maybe. She liked Kyle, and saw him as a benefit to her and to the rebellion. To believe he was capable of such cold-blooded killing. No, she couldn't let her personal feelings enter into this. Kyle had done it, that much was clear. And whatever had happened to him had affected the moldy Crow as well. How else could this old ship fly like that? But what had happened to Kyle? According to Skywalker's reports, Kyle hadn't acted in a malevolent manner. Rather, his words had conveyed a matter-of-fact attitude, getting the job done. But the power he had demonstrated, able to take control of 3 X-Wings and activate their weapon systems. She hadn't seen such a display since. Her body gave an involuntary shudder as she remembered those dark days. Chancellor Palpatine was taking on more and more executive powers, all in the name of saving the Republic and winning the war against the Separatists. Although she had been much younger then, Mon Mothma had seen the threat Palpatine posed, although many of her fellow senators either didn't or chose to ignore it. A few, however, did listen to her, including Senator Amidala of Naboo, and for a time, it seemed that things were going their way. With the destruction of General Grievous, it seemed that the war was finally over and Palpatine would step down as Chancellor. But then, had come that terrible, terrible day when the clone troopers had turned against the Jedi, killing so many of them. And then had come Palpatine's grand announcement that the Jedi had turned against the Republic and had even attempted to assassinate him. Mon had seen the terrible scarring on the Chancellor's face, and while a worm of doubt crept into her, it had been squashed when Palpatine explained that the Republic would now become the Empire. Her heart sank, all hopes of getting the Chancellor to step down gone. And her colleagues, so many of them had greeted the words with thunderous applause. She knew then, for certain, the ailing Republic was finally and completely dead, and from his ashes rose Palpatine and the Empire. She remembered returning to her quarters, feeling despondent. And then had come the message from Bail Organa. She soon knew the truth of what had happened to the Jedi. She had surprised herself with her reaction. Rather than feeling even more hopeless, she felt a tiny flame of defiance spring to life inside her. Her anger over the injustice of what had happened fed that flame, making it grow brighter and stronger. She decided at that moment that she would not surrender the sovereignty of her planet to the Empire. She would fight this wherever and however she could. As quietly as she could, Mon Mothma contacted the small circle of her supporters, letting them know of her plans. Some tried to dissuade her, saying it was too late or that now wasn't the right time. But a few agreed with her, and from the small circle, the rebellion had been born. Her mouth curved upward slightly. True, the struggle had been tough, sometimes nearly hopeless. But the rebellion had survived attempt after attempt by the Empire to destroy it, and thrived. With the destruction of the Death Star, many star systems began to reconsider their lives under the rule of the Empire. But if all the old things had indeed passed away, including the Jedi, then what was happening to Kyle? Master Kenobi and Master Yoda had both disappeared into self-imposed exile, not heard from for decades. And with them, stories of their powers had become mere legend now. Her eyes moved over the Crow. How else could what happened be explained? Could it be that Kyle Katarn was? Turning on her heel, Mon Mothma moved to the hangar bay doors. There was one way to get the answer she needed. Go and ask him. How do I get myself into these things? Kyle thought. Are you sure? He nodded. Seated opposite him, Plastin Morass pushed back in his chair, exhaling loudly. Over his shoulder, he said, "I don't see what else we can ask, Commander. We've covered this thing backwards and forwards, and we haven't learned anything new." Standing just behind Plaston, Luke Skywalker nodded thoughtfully, arms crossed over his chest. "I suppose you're right. But just to be sure, Katarn, are you absolutely sure there's nothing else you can remember?" Kyle dropped his eyes to the table, struggling to bite back the first thing that came to mind. He was so tired of their questions. It seemed that he had done nothing but answer them for the last hour. And the blonde kid kept pushing, asking if he was sure about what he remembered. All Kyle wanted was to get out of there and check on Jan. He had woken up in sickbay again. Dr. Berth informed him that aside from mild dehydration and oxygen deprivation, he was fine. Jan, however, had been injured during the battle and was in surgery. She took a blow to the head that opened up a pretty nasty gash, but nothing that can't be repaired. When Plaston had shown and said he needed to talk to Kyle, the young man thought he'd only be gone a short time. Now, after seemingly endless questions, he had had enough. He looked up at Skywalker, who was gazing at him with expectant eyes. "What part of I can't remember don't you understand, Skywalker?" he said angrily, glaring at the young commander. Then at Plaston, "You both keep talking about what happened like I should know." "But I don't, okay?" Skywalker's cheeks reddened, and Plaston gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. "Oh boy, I've done it now. Here we go." Kyle mentally braced himself. The blonde kid opened his mouth to speak, but didn't say anything. He turned to look over his right shoulder like someone had called him. He stayed in that pose for nearly a minute. When he turned back around, Skywalker's face was composed. "Look, Katarn, I'm not the enemy here. Believe it or not, I am on your side. And had you seen what I did, you'd understand why I'm asking all these questions." "Well, maybe you could enlighten me, Skywalker. I'd like to know what happened too." Luke nodded, pulling his communicator free of his belt and activating it. "Rogue Leader to Rogue 2. A moment passed. Then, to here. "Wedge, do you still have the gun camera footage from the battle?" "Right here, boss. I need you to bring it in the portable holoprojector to conference room S1, deck 5. I'm on my way." 10 minutes later, the doors to the room parted as Wedge stepped inside. He placed the holoprojector in the middle of the table and inserted a silvery module into a receptacle on the side of the device. The air over the table shimmered, resolving itself an image of space. Kyle could the all-too-familiar shape of the Star Destroyer and a plethora of TIE fighters. "What you're seeing," Luke said, "is gun camera footage from X-Wing during the battle." The image began to move as the X-Wing began to maneuver. Fascinated by the clarity of the images, Kyle felt as if the entire room were moving about him. When the X-Wing's laser struck a TIE fighter, he found himself pushing away from the explosion. Wedge paused the video, giving Luke a knowing look. "Sorry," Kyle said, feeling embarrassed. Luke waved a hand. "I reacted the same way the first time I saw one of these. Right, Wedge?" The tow-headed man said nothing, but his grin grew even wider. "Now that you've had your fun, could you advance the footage to where we saw the ship?" "Sure, boss." Manipulating the projector's controls, Wedge reset the video and set it to play again. At this point, Luke said, the Crow had been disabled and the second Star Destroyer had just appeared. The men listened to the crosstalk between the X-Wings when Wedge's voice called out. "What the hell did? Whoa. Wedge. What's happening? Rogue 2, come in." They heard Wedge's shaky voice as he responded to Luke's voice, then to discussing what Wedge had seen. "See what? Wedge, I don't." "It should be any second now," Luke said, gazing intently at the video. "There. Do you see it?" Kyle stared at the image, seeing only a mishmash of X-Wings and TIE fighters engaging each other. "Sorry, Skywalker, there's..." His voice died away as the ship came into view. It flashed past the camera's point of view, disappearing. Wedge paused the video. Silence reigned in the room for a long minute. "Was that?" Kyle asked, finding his voice. "See for yourself." Wedge. At the pilot's direction, the video reversed, allowing the ship to come back into view. Right there, Luke said. Pause it again. Wedge complied, and the picture went still, the ship fully in view. Kyle's eyes went wide and his mouth dropped. It was the crow, and yet not the crow. The hull had changed from its mismatched color scheme to ebony so deep and dark, it seemed to blot out the stars. The engine plume, normally a blue-white, was scarlet. That can't be my ship, he managed to say. Luke nodded at Wedge, who started the video again. Kyle watched in stunned fascination as the crow arced towards the second Star Destroyer, dodging turbo laser bolts with seeming ease. You might want to brace yourself, Katarn, Luke said. What? Luke shook his head. He couldn't answer. On the tape, Luke's voice sounded, calling the moldy crow. When he heard the response, Kyle fell back in his chair, face a mask of shock. It was his own voice he heard talking back to Skywalker. But there was something wrong with it. When he heard himself laugh, Kyle cringed. It wasn't his laugh. It was evil. Yes, that was it, evil. He watched the crow penetrate the destroyer's hangar bay, emerging less than a minute later. He heard himself order the X-Wings to fire their torpedoes. Luke protested, to which Kyle heard himself say, Fine, I'll do it myself. Kyle listened to the stunned transmissions as the X-Wings pilots saw their torpedo systems activate by themselves and fire. When the destroyer exploded, Luke had Wedge stop the video. No one said anything for several minutes. Kyle began to shake his head. He didn't want to believe what he had just seen. It couldn't be, that just wasn't him. But the truth of the video was undeniable. He looked up at the other men. I did these things. I said those words. Both Luke and Wedge nodded. No! Kyle suddenly cried, pushing away from the table and standing up. I couldn't have. I didn't. Why can't I remember? Plasden rose to his feet, crossed over to where Kyle stood. He put a hand on the younger man's shoulder, feeling the flesh beneath his tunic trembling. We don't know why, Kyle. That's why Luke and I have been asking you all these questions. We're trying to figure out what happened. But I don't remember. We know, Luke said, especially consider your reaction just now. The question now is, what did happen? I don't know. Kyle, try and calm down. You didn't do anything wrong. How can you say that? You saw the video, didn't you? Yes, I did, Plasden replied. But tell me, what did you do wrong? The X-Wings. Okay, the older man concerned. Somehow you did take control of the X-Wings without permission. But you did it to eliminate that Star Destroyer. But something's not right, Plasden. How could all those things and not remember any of them? I don't know the answer to that one, Kyle. But we will find out, okay? Gradually, as Plasden's words sunk in, Kyle began to calm down. The trembling in his body ceased and the haunted look in his eyes went away. But then he remembered Jan. While he had been doing all that stuff in the video, Jan had gotten hurt. Had his actions caused it? What about Jan? Plasden. She got hurt during the battle, probably because of me. You say I did nothing wrong, but she's lying in sickbay right now because of me. It was a battle, Kyle. It's not like you meant for Jan to get hurt. But how can I be sure, Plasden? I can't remember the stuff I did we saw in the video. How do we know that it wasn't those actions that caused her to get hurt? Look, Kyle, Plasden's communicator dinged for attention. Maras here, he answered. This is Dr. Berth. I'm looking for Kyle Katarn. Plasden had just started to hold the communicator out when Kyle snatched it from his hands. I'm here, Doc, he said, almost frantic. How's Jan? She's perfectly fine, Kyle. Berth replied. I called to let you know she's out of surgery, and can I see her? Yes, but I'll be right there, Kyle said, switching off the communicator and tossing it back. Look, I know we need to find out what happened, but right now. Kyle, Plasden said, interrupting Go. Berth took another look at Jan's vitals. All the readings were looking good. A little best of resting. A cacophony of pounding footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Before the sickbay doors were open all the way, a panting, Red-faced Katarn dashed inside, skidding to a stop inches away from where Berth stood. "Where is?" he said between breaths, then caught sight of her. All the strength seemed to flow out of him as his eyes took her in. Jan lay in the bed, eyes closed, her long hair spread out in a wave on the pillow. Her chest rose and fell regularly. He could the beginning of a line of stitches running across the left side of her head. "Jan," Kyle whispered. Then out loud he asked, "Is she all right?" "Yes, Kyle," Berth said, still recovering from the shock of the young man's entrance. "She's fine, just as I told you. The surgery went very well." "How long before she wakes up?" "Well, the anesthesia won't wear off for a while yet. I'd say 7 or 8 hours. Could I wait here until she wakes up?" Berth shook his head. "I can give you a few minutes, Kyle, but that's all. Right now, Jan needs her rest. And after that battle, so do you." "Come on, Doc, I mean it, Kyle." He considered whether to press the matter. Sick bay was the doctor's domain, and if he called security. "Okay, Doc, I give 5 minutes. No more," Berth replied, stepping away to allow Kyle some privacy. He gazed at her for a long minute. Grabbing a nearby chair, he sat down next to her bed. Jan's arms were at her sides, and Kyle reached out and tentatively took her right hand in his. "I'm sorry, Jan. It's my fault you're here right now. If I hadn't insisted on going out there, you wouldn't be." He trailed off, thinking about what might have been. "Something happened to me out there today. Jan, I don't know if you saw it or not, but I changed, became something else, and I'm wondering if that something else is what hurt you." He looked into her face, wishing that she was awake. "What I saw in that video, Jan, it was wrong. It's like whatever happened to me affected the ship too." He paused a moment more. "I'm scared, Jan, whatever it was that I became today. I don't want it to happen again, but if I can't remember what happened, then how can I keep it from happening again?" She didn't answer. "Kyle." He looked up to see the doctor standing by the bed. "It's time. We need to let her rest now." Kyle nodded. "Okay, Doc." He started to let go of Jan's hand when it tightened around his. "Kyle," Berth said again, "you agreed to 5 minutes. Now." "Doc," Kyle said, urgency in his voice. "Look." Berth leaned down and saw the joined hands. Kyle's grip on her hand was loose, but Jan's hand was clamped tightly around his. "What happened?" "When I moved to go, her hand tightened around mine. The sound, when it came, was low, practically a whisper, not your fault." "Kyle, did you?" "Wasn't me, Doc. Not your fault." The voice was stronger this time. The two men looked at Jan, the only other person in the room. "It couldn't have been her," Berth said. "She's still asleep." But with the sudden fluttering, her eyelids began to move. Slowly they opened. The pupils beneath were dilated and unfocused, but for Kyle and Berth, it seemed as if she did see them. "Not your fault," Jan said. Her voice was still low, but recognizable. "Not your fault about what?" Berth asked. Kyle waited a long moment before answering. He looked down at the floor, unable to meet the eyes that looked at him. "What happened during the battle? It's my fault Jan got hurt." "No," she whispered urgently, her grip on his hand tightening to the point that it hurt. "It's not your fault." "But Jan." "No," she said, her voice getting quieter now. "Not your fault, Katarn." Her hand suddenly went slack. "Doc, what's happening?" Berth stepped forward, checked the instruments monitoring Jan. "She's all right, Kyle, just sleeping." "But Doc, how did she?" "The human will is a powerful thing, Kyle. Jan must have heard you, even in her sleep. And she wanted you to know that whatever happened, she doesn't blame you." Silence descended as Kyle considered what Jan and Berth had said. How could Jan know what happened? She was unconscious during the attack on the Star Destroyer. Could she be right? He considered what Plasden had told him, that he hadn't really done anything wrong. But something deep inside him knew that whatever had happened, no matter the results, had been wrong. "I need to go and think about this." Standing up, Kyle looked at Jan one more time. "Thanks, partner." He turned, moving out of the room. Where are you going? To shower and change. Get something to eat and then go see what kind of shape the crow is in. You'll let me know when she comes to. Of course, but Kyle. He stopped, turned back around. Yeah, Doc. Are you all right? He shook his head. Physically, yes. As for the rest, I really don't know. Something happened to me today, Doc, something wrong. And yet I can't remember any of it. It reminds me of a line I heard in a movie, there is a hole in your mind. I need to figure out what happened. But even more importantly, why? With that, Kyle turned on his heel and left sickbay, leaving a perplexed Dr. Berth in his wake. She seemed to be floating in a white fog, not visible in any direction she looked. I have to be dreaming, she thought. Jan. A voice. Calling her name? It seemed to be coming from behind her. But when she turned round, there was no one there, only more of the unending field of white. Jan. Now the voice came from her left. But there was nothing there when she turned to it. Where are you? She called into the fog. Jan, can you hear me? The voice sounded familiar. Kyle. She called. Jan. Suddenly the white fog over her head parted and threw. A ray of light flashed down into her face. She threw up her hands against the blinding light. But it was no use. The light was too strong, undeniable. Berth touched her shoulder, giving it another slight shake. Jan, can you hear me? Her eyes, which had been tightly closed, trembled, the lids fluttering. Easy, Jan, the doctor cautioned, take it slow. Her eyelids opened, then just as quickly closed as the pupils quickly contracted against the onslaught of light. Give it a moment, the doctor said. Jan opened her eyes more slowly this time, eyes finally adjusting. She turned to look at him. Dr. Berth. Yes, Jan. Where am I? Sick bay. Sick bay. She said incredulously. You were brought here right after the crow was brought aboard. The crow. Tractor. She closed her eyes again, gathering herself. Okay, Jan, you can handle this. Something happened during the battle. Of course, she thought, remembering the panel exploding, the blow to her head. When she opened her eyes to look at the doctor again, he could see that she was more in control now, calmer. Okay, doctor. Perhaps you'd better fill me in as to what happened since I lost consciousness and woke up here. Berth took a few minutes to relate the events of the battle, including the second Star Destroyer, Rogue Squadron, and the New Hope jumping to hyperspace. I'm not sure exactly how, but the second Star Destroyer was destroyed, and the first one retreated soon after. Rogue Squadron took care of the rest of the TIE fighters. It was shortly after that we jumped back to the battle site. The crow was drifting and had to be tractored into the hangar bay. We took a hit from an ion cannon, Jan said. That must have been it. Then, you must have been injured during the battle. When you arrived in sickbay, I discovered a fairly large laceration across the top of your head. Fortunately, it wasn't deep. Jan reached up to her head, feeling the even rows of stitches. Her eyes suddenly grew wide. What about Kyle? Berth smiled. Aside from not listening to his doctor's orders to get some rest, he's fine. Jan let out a relieved breath. Good. In fact, I promised him I'd call as soon as you woke up. If you'll excuse me. Of course, she replied. Berth began to step out of the room, then snapped his fingers, turning back round. I almost forgot. You have some visitors waiting to see you. Are you up to it? Definitely, Jan said, smiling. Who is it? Berth, however, was already leaning around the edge of the privacy curtain. You can come in now. Raising the bed so she was able to sit up, Jan waited expectantly, thinking it would be Mon Mothma. But instead, 3 people stepped inside. Her mouth dropped open. You. I still can't believe it, Kyle thought, as his eyes roamed over the patchwork hull. How could this ship do what I saw in the video? Sure, Jan and I have taken good care of it, but taking on a Star Destroyer. It just didn't seem believable. And as he inspected the Crow systems, Kyle found some battle damage, but nothing that added up to taking on an Imperial capital ship. He set to work, starting with the shield capacitors, which were completely burnt out. As he worked, Kyle reviewed the battle in his mind. He knew that something had happened to him shortly after the TIE wreckage had struck the ship. But what? Absorbed in the work and his own thoughts, he didn't hear her approach until she spoke. So here you are. I suppose I should have anticipated this. Looking over his shoulder, Kyle saw her standing nearby, a half smile on her face. Mon Mothma? She raised an eyebrow at him. You sound surprised to see me? Not really, he answered, clambering down off the crow's port wing. I knew we'd have to talk sooner or later. And I assume you're trying to make it later. Yeah, Kyle replied, raising his hands in a you-know gesture. She opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off. Mon Mothma, I know what you're going to ask. I don't know what happened to me during the battle. I've gone it over and over again in my mind, but I can't recall anything beyond some TIE wreckage hitting the crow. Everything after that is a complete blank, until I came to here on the New Hope. I just can't remember. I wish I could. The older woman paused for a long moment, then said, Actually, I was going to ask how you were feeling, and then ask about the battle. Oh, Kyle said, feeling a bit embarrassed. Sorry. She waved the apology away. You've been through an ordeal, Kyle. And after talking to Plaston, I know you've got to be quite frustrated not knowing what happened to you during the battle. Let me make it clear that whatever happened, that your actions helped save the New Hope as well as the pilots of Rogue Squadron, and you, and Jan. Kyle's eyes fell away from hers. But Jan still got hurt. As a direct result of the Imperial attack, Kyle. Not because of your action or inaction. Had it not been for your attack on the Star Destroyer, it is very unlikely that either one of you would have survived. His head came back up. Mon Mothma's words had penetrated through the mass of guilt and self-doubt in his mind. Thank you, Mon Mothma, he said, managing a small smile. It helps to hear you say that. I do want to ask you something else, Kyle. Oh, he thought. Here it comes. We've talked about these voices you've heard in your head, and how they seem to have aided you on earlier missions. Is it possible that what happened during the battle was like one of the earlier encounters? He thought over that for nearly a minute. I suppose it is possible, Mon Mothma. But when the voices helped me before, I can remember what happened. I didn't always understand it, but I can remember what they said and what happened afterward. She considered that, then said, Let me ask you this, Kyle. Do you remember how, or should I say, what you were feeling? Kyle smiled. That's easy. I was mad, I guess you could say angry. How angry? Well, considering I'm in a disabled ship, no weapons, no shield, no comm, basically a big floating target, I was very angry and frustrated. Not to be rude, Mon Mothma, but are you going somewhere with this? The older woman waited a long moment before answering. The Jedi used to associate anger with the dark side. I remember Master Yoda saying once that anger was a path that leads to suffering. Could it be that, Kyle? No, she decided. This was foolish thinking. The Emperor had destroyed all the Jedi in his grand plan to create the perfect empire, free from the danger of Jedi. Perhaps the Force had something to do with what happened to Kyle, but her talk with him and Plaston's report made it clear that Kyle had no awareness of the Force, nor did she see any desire in him to know more about it. He accepted what happened before his good fortune, no more. Still, she would keep an eye on him, just in case. Mon Mothma? Kyle pressed. Oh, she replied, realizing that he was staring at her. Forgive me, Kyle. I was lost in thought for a moment. I thought I might have an idea about what happened to you, but it appears I was mistaken. What was it? Nothing of importance, she said dismissively, her tone making it clear further questions were not welcome. Okay, Kyle said. Well, maybe I should, his communicator sounded. Pulling it from his belt, he turned it on. This is Kyle. Kyle, this is Dr. Berth. I called to let you know Jan is awake, Anne. I'm on my way, Kyle replied, shutting the communicator off and returning it to his belt. If you'll excuse me, Mon Mothma. Of course, she replied, smiling at him. Give Jan my best. I will, he said, heading for the hangar bay doors. You. Hello, Jan? I can't believe it. The trio filled the small space in front of her bed. Jan's eyes moved to each of them in turn, her look of surprise turning in a dumbfounded smile. Alessa. Wexter. Galder. Hey there, Ors, said Galder, smiling at her. Long time no see. I thought. The Death Star. You thought we were killed when Aldrin was destroyed, Alessa finished for her. We almost were, if it hadn't been for Wexter. Don't be so dramatic, Alessa, the third man said. Besides, it was your idea to take the ship out for a test run. Yes, but if you hadn't. Hold on a second, Jan said, still smiling, her eyes shiny. I want to hear everything that happened. But first, get yourselves over here and give me a hug. Alessa was the first to move, her own eyes brimming. The two women hugged each other tightly, sharing in the joy of finding each other again. I am so glad to see you, Jan murmured against her friend's shoulder, so glad you're alive. Every time there was a Newsnet report about the rebellion, I wondered if you were all right, Jan. The women hugged a moment more. Then Alessa stepped back to allow Galder to approach. But instead of reaching for her, he took one of Jan's outstretched hands, bringing it to his lips. Still the romantic I see, Jan said, wrapping her free arm around Galder's neck and pulling him into a hug. I'm glad you're all right, Jan, he said, gently breaking the embrace and stepping back. I've missed you. There was a pregnant pause. Then she said, well, what are you waiting for, Wexter? Get over here. She could see he was trying not to let the emotion of the moment overwhelm him. With his lips pinched together in a grim smile, Wexter stepped to Jan's beside and leaned in. She had pulled him into a tight hug. He hesitated a moment, then hugged her back with equal fervor. I've missed you, Wexter. When I thought you were dead, it really hurt. Now, Jan, he harumphed, you should know by now old Wexter's too flaggard stubborn to die. She smiled against his shoulder, held him a moment longer, then let go, but not before loudly kissing him on the cheek. Jan couldn't but chuckle at Wexter's embarrassed look as he stepped back. What was that old expression? The more things change, the more they stay the same. So what happened to you anyway? Alessa asked. Oh, Jan said, gesturing at her surroundings. We got attacked by an Imperial Star Destroyer. My partner and I went out to help fight off the TIE fighters until the New Hope was able to jump to hyperspace. A Star Destroyer? Galder asked, his eyes wide. Are you serious? Jan nodded. Absolutely. And then during the battle, our ship was hit by an ion blast and disabled. There we were, floating around like a big target, and you'll never guess who showed up. Rogue Squadron. Wait a minute, Wexter said, waving his hands in an expression of disbelief. You mean the Rogue Squadron? That's Luke Skywalker's unit, isn't it? I've heard of him, Alessa added. He's the one who destroyed the Death Star. Well, Jan, sounds like you're sharing space with the elite of the rebellion. Just like Alderaan, huh? Please, Galder. It isn't like that at all. We sent a distress call, and they showed up, that's all. As you say? Wait a minute, Jan, said Alessa. Did I hear you mention a partner? Oh no, Jan thought, seeing her friend's expression. Why did I have to mention Kyle? Oh well, might as well get it over with. Yes, Alessa? A partner. He works with me on missions for the rebellion. Oh, so it's a he, is it? Alessa pressed, stepping closer, her eyes locked on Jan's. So is he cute? What? Jan exclaimed, completely caught off guard. He. Well, it's... Yes, Jan, Galder said, joining in, do tell. Jan glared at him a moment. Fine. His name is... The door to sickbay opened, and the sound of running feet cut her off. Skidding to a stop just outside the privacy curtains, Kyle took a minute to slow his breathing down. He had run all the way from the hangar bay in his urgency to see her. When he was able to breathe without panting, Kyle slid aside the curtains and stepped inside. The greeting he had prepared died on his lips as he spotted the other 3 people in the room. He didn't recognize any of them, but from their expressions, they seemed to be expecting him. He looked to Jan, about to ask what was going on. But the look on her face brought him up short. She was staring at him wide-eyed, as if the last thing she wanted right now was to see him. But in the time it took him to draw another breath, her face changed. She smiled at him. "Kyle," she called, waving an arm at him. "Come in. I want you to meet some friends of mine." He hesitated a moment. Maybe he should come back later. "Jan, The smile disappeared. "Get in here, Katarn." He knew that tone, and knew better than to say no. He stepped inside. One of the men stepped towards him, extending a hand. "You must be Jan's partner." "I'm Wexter Wayfarer." "Kyle Katarn." "Nice to meet you, Wexter." Several years older than Kyle, Wexter couldn't help but look the part of a mechanic. From his permanently stained coveralls to the tools dangling from his belt, Wexter was clearly a man who had worked his hands for years. And by the way the coveralls stretched over the man's abdomen, he rarely, if ever, missed a meal. His hair and mustache were a mixture of gray and white, but his blue eyes were lively, and his smile was genuine. He indicated the other man. "And this is—" "I can't speak for myself, Wexter," Galder said, his tone flat, nearly emotionless. His dark eyes shifted to Kyle. "Galder Thunks," he announced. For a moment, he stared at Kyle's outstretched hand, then reached out and took it. His grip was firm and strong, but not friendly. A spark of pain arced through Kyle's arm. Realizing that Galder was squeezing his hand, whether by accident or on purpose, Kyle reacted by squeezing back. He forced himself to smile at the taller man, and squeezed harder even as he introduced himself. There was a flicker of surprise in Galder's eyes. Clearly, he hadn't expected this, his own hand beginning to hurt. The mounting pressure suddenly vanished as Galder let go, moving back a step. Kyle took a moment to examine the man. Polished black shoes led up to perfectly creased black pants and a shirt of dark purple. It was a surprise to see that unlike Wexter, Thunks was completely bald, his olive skin gleaming in the overhead light. His appearance indicated to Kyle that Galder had been a man of means and high society. "And I'm about as working class as you can get," Kyle thought. "So," a voice said teasingly, "you're Jan's new partner." Kyle turned to regard the woman near Jan's bed, caught his attention. Short black-brown hair lay in straight lines down the sides of her face, curling up just above her shoulders. Her smile revealed 2 rows of gleaming white teeth. Her olive skin stood out in contrast to Jan's, making her look paler in comparison. Giving her a wink, she stepped towards Kyle. Her low-heeled black boots clicked slightly against the deck. She wore a pair of loose black pants that seemed to add to her height and a long-sleeve shirt whose purple hue was lighter than that of Galder's. Over the shirt was a short white jacket that covered her shoulders and arms, dropping down to just above her waist. "And I'm Alessa Thunks." She held a hand out to him and Kyle took it, feeling her warm, smooth skin. The fine bones on the back of her hand slid against his as they let go. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. The irises were purple and seemed to glow with their own inner light. Alessa took a moment to allow her eyes to rove over Kyle. He wasn't exactly the type of man she expected to see Jan with. But perhaps there was more to him than met the eye. "Hold still a moment," she said, wetting a finger. She reached up, wiping her finger across his cheek. "I guess you must have been in a hurry to get here." At first, Kyle didn't know what she meant, until he saw the smear of dirt on her finger. Looking down at himself, Kyle mentally cursed himself. In his headlong rush to get to the hangar bay, he hadn't taken the time to change. His workman's coveralls were stained with grease and dirt. That probably explains the look Jan gave me when I walked in, he thought. He looked at her. She had a bemused smile on her face. "You do know how to make an entrance, Katarn," she said, chuckling. Galder, Wexter, and Alessa laughed with her. Cheeks flaming with embarrassment, Kyle waited for the laughter to die down. "If you all will excuse me, I'll be back as soon I've changed." Turning round, Kyle passed through the curtains. Galder waited until the sickbay doors closed before speaking. So, where did you find him? Jan knew that tone all too well. I didn't find him, Galder, she said, eyes turning to look directly at him, and his name is Kyle. I'll thank you to remember that. Now, Jan, Wexter jumped in. Galder didn't mean anything. He looked to the other man. Isn't that right? When Galder didn't say anything, Alessa stepped in. You need to remember we're guests here, brother dear. And with Alderaan gone, we need friends and allies. Galder's face crumpled slightly at the mention of Alderaan, and for a long moment silence reigned as each of them privately remembered their home planet. That reminds me, Jan said, breaking the silence. How did the three of you survive? Wexter and Galder looked to Alessa, who shrugged before answering. It wasn't as if I had any grand plan or anything. Father had purchased me a new personal cruiser, and the ion drive was acting up. I talked to Wexter, and he offered to come over and take a look at it. I couldn't detect any problems at first, Wexter said, taking up the story, so I asked Alessa if we could take the ship out for a quick flight. I figured that whatever was wrong, I'd be able to find out once the ship was airborne. I just happened to walk into the hangar at that moment, said Galder. When I heard what Wexter was planning, I decided to go along to help fly the ship. We had just gotten out of the atmosphere when the drive began misfiring, Wexter said. So, I asked Galder and Alessa to hold the ship on course while I inspected the drive. Turns out the fuel cells had been misaligned and were feeding unequal power to the engines. That couldn't have been easy to repair, Jan offered. It wasn't, Wexter said, nodding. It took me 2 hours just to unknot the fuel lines themselves, and then another hour to complete a full systems test. And that's when it happened. What? Jan asked anxiously. We were nearly finished with the power-up test when we received a call from orbital control. They advised us of a large object approaching the system. I think it was about 30 minutes later when we saw it. The Death Star, Jan said quietly. Yes, Galder replied. You can't imagine it, Jan. It was so immense, it blotted out the stars. He trailed off, unable to continue. It took up position in high orbit over Alderaan. I came up to the cockpit and we sat there, staring at it. Orbital control tried hailing it, but never received a response. And then it began to rotate. Alessa's eyes were glowing with unshed tears. We saw the immense depression in the surface, and then it began to glow. You know what happened next? Yes, Jan said, fighting back her own tears. I do. Silence descended once again. This time it was Wexter who spoke first. I don't know how long we sat there, trying to understand what had just happened. The Death Star began to move away, heading out of the system, I guess. I really didn't notice. I do know all three of us were thinking the same thing. What do we do now? Both Galder and Alessa nodded. So what happened? Jan prompted. Galder remembered reports of a rebel cell a few systems away. Alessa replied. With Alderaan gone, the rebels seemed like the best choice. We traveled for almost 2 days, broadcasting a call for assistance on every frequency we could think of, Wexter said. Speaking for myself, the situation was getting pretty hopeless when, on the 3rd day, we received a reply. A Y-wing on Deep Space Patrol picked up our signal and rendezvoused with us, Galder added. When we told the pilot where we were from, he escorted us to his command vessel. Fortunately, I was able to secure us transport to a permanent base. Oh, please, Galder, Alessa said, rolling her eyes at him. She turned to Jan. We were shipped out with the tech team being dispatched to a rebel base in the Yavin system. Wait a minute, Jan said, surprise in her voice. You don't mean Yavin 4? The same, Alessa replied. In fact, we arrived less than a day before the Death Star was detected approaching the system. Jan's expression matched the frustration in Alessa's voice. From the frying pan into the fire. You said it, Wexter added. We watched as the rebel launched what fighters they had. Not nearly enough, it seemed to me. Glad I was wrong. Conversation blended together as Jan related her and Kyle's part in monitoring the attack on the Death Star. Wexter and Alessa described how things seemed lost when the remnants of Red Squadron made their last-ditch run on the exhaust port. That kid, Skywalker, Wexter said with admiration. He must have had nerves of steel. His wingmen were gone, TIE fighters closing on him. He did have help, Galder added. True, Wexter continued. That smuggler ship, the Millennium Falcon. I've never seen a worse-looking ship in my life. But the way it flew, well, I was impressed. You think the Falcon has something to look at? Wait till you see the Crow. The Crow? Galder asked, confused. Jan went on to describe the ship. You wouldn't think it had managed to lift off the deck, much less fly and fight, but it's proven to be quite a ship. Well, I'll have to get a look at it, Wexter said. Look all you want, Jan said, but no touch. Oh, come on, Jan, the old man said defensively, holding up his hands. I can make anything work better with these babies. Like you did my first airspeeder. He waved at her dismissively. That was an accident, and you know it. How was I to know the power plant wouldn't accept the power boost? How about the large label that read, Danger, do not exceed power core limits. Damage to power plant and passenger could result. I don't remember any label. Sure you don't, Wexter? Jan said, smiling at her friend. Just remember, you can look at my ship, but no touchy. Understand? For a moment, it seemed as if he might protest. But under Jan's stern gaze, Wexter surrendered. All right. All right what? Jan pressed. All right, I won't touch your ship, Wexter said automatically. Happy? Very. Both Galder and Alessa broke out laughing. I see things haven't changed much, Alessa said, wiping a tear from her eye. You didn't answer my question earlier, Jan, Galder said. Where did you meet up with this? Kyle. She sighed. That is a long story. We've got the time? Jan hesitated. While she didn't see any harm in telling her friends about Kyle, there were personal things she knew about him, things that might be better said with Kyle in the room. As if on cue, the doors to sickbay opened. A moment later, Kyle stepped between the curtains. His hair was still slightly damp, but his face and hands were clean. He had dressed in a pair of loose gray slacks, with a matching gray vest. The shirt underneath was a dark red, a splash of color that completed the outfit quite nicely. Well, look at you, Alessa said. Kyle smiled at her, then at Jan. You like? Very much, both women said at the same time. Off to his right, Galder gave off a snort, careful to keep it low enough that no one heard it. Alessa was just asking me about you and I met Kyle, Jan said. Do you mind? He shook his head. Not at all. Nearly 45 minutes passed as Jan related her and Kyle's first meeting when he was still a stormtrooper. Both Galder and Wexter perked up at hearing that. Jan went on to relate the second meeting between her and Kyle, and his subsequent to defect. I can still remember me, Roscoe, and Waller arguing over whether we should even let Kyle go with us. Little did we know that he had already decided. Okay, let me explain something here. Kyle cut in. Jan and her team knew that Governor Donner has a squad of security coming to arrest us. They were minutes away. I knew if we were going to have any chance of escaping, someone had to do something. So Kyle sneaks aboard our ship and starts pre-flight. We didn't even realize he was gone until we heard the main drive coming online. I didn't sneak aboard, Kyle answered defensively. I walked aboard while you three were arguing to get the ship ready. Oh, and get this. Rather than be grateful for my help, they drew their weapons on me. Now who's not being fair? Jan interrupted. We didn't know what you were doing. It could have been anything from sabotage to planting a listening device. Oh, please, Kyle said in exasperation. Wait a minute, Galder said. You mentioned the Governor Donner. Not Dal Donner of Dara IV. The same, Kyle replied. How is it someone from the Outer Rim knew a planetary governor? Both Alessa and Jan threw Galder looks of warning, but Kyle seemed unfazed. His son, Nathan, and I attended the Imperial Academy together. After graduation, Nathan invited me to join him and his family aboard the Queen of Empire. Ah, I see. It gets better, Galder, Kyle continued, smirking. No sooner had we arrived on the New Hope than Jan has a couple security officers take me into custody. What? Wexter exclaimed. Jan, you didn't. She shrugged. I didn't have a choice. Kyle was still technically an Imperial at the time, and we had to take precautions. But arresting him? Alessa pressed. It's like I had him thrown in the brig or anything. It was just until he met Mon Mothma and formally declared his intentions of leaving the Empire and joining the rebellion. Kyle raised his eyebrows. Technically, what Jan had said about him joining the rebellion wasn't true, but he decided to concede the point. So how did you end up partnered together? Galder asked. Mon Mothma had a mission she needed my help with, Kyle answered, and when she advised me that I would need a mission officer to help with planning and logistics, Jan volunteered. Did you? Alessa said mischievously. I wonder why. Jan started to speak, intending to deny that her reasons were anything but personal, but Kyle beat her to it. 2 reasons. One was that at this point, I didn't know anyone in the rebellion aside from Jan and Mon Mothma, so it seemed a logical choice. And the second reason, Alessa pressed. I was too afraid to say no to her. The room erupted in laughter, then a hoof as pillow struck Kyle full in the chest. Jan was frowning at him, but the hint of a smile was visible as well. It's true, he exclaimed. Let me tell about the first time I did say no and what happened. It was. Grabbing another pillow, Jan drew her arm to throw it. You'd better shut up right now, Katarn. Try as he might, Kyle couldn't stop laughing. But as the pillow sailed towards him, he remembered to duck, allowing the object to hit Wexter full in the face. As the pillow fell to the floor, a surprised Wexter looked at Jan, whose cheeks were flaming red with embarrassment. Oh no, she exclaimed. Wexter, I'm sorry. Unable to hold it in any longer, Jan began to laugh too, joined by Wexter and the others a moment later. Hey, what's going on in here? Still chuckling, Kyle, Alessa, Wexter, and Galder all turned to see Dr. Berth enter the room, a frown on his face. Someone want to tell what's happening. I could hear you all the way in my office. Sorry, Doc, Kyle said. It's my fault. We were kidding around about why Jan and I became partners, and I guess we got a bit crazy. You have our apologies, Doctor, Galder said formally. We did not mean to disturb you. No apologies are necessary, Berth said, but you do need to tone it down just a bit. I have other patients trying to sleep. It won't happen again, Jan said, looking fixedly at Kyle. What? He asked innocently. You know? Besides, Jan still needs her rest. So if you wouldn't mind. Of course, Doctor, Alessa, moving to Jan's bedside. We'll see you later. Count on it, Jan replied. Waving goodbye, Wexter and Galder followed Alessa out of the room. That means you too, Kyle? Okay, Doc, just give me a minute. 1 minute, Berth said firmly, stepping outside. That's all. Kyle moved to Jan's bedside. I'm so relieved to see you all right, Jan. She reached a hand out to him. I'm glad you're okay too. What happened to us out there? Taking her hand in his, Kyle looked down at the floor for a moment before continuing. I wish I knew. The last thing I remember is some Tyrekage hitting the crow and then nothing. How did we get back here? Jan asked. You don't know? No. Something happened to me out there, something very strange. When I saw the battle footage, it was almost unbelievable. Jan tightened her hold on his hand, seeing the mixture of tension and worry on his face. Kyle, I can't explain it. Jan, you need to see the footage first. Then we can talk. Just then Dr. Berth stepped back in. He opened his mouth to speak, but Kyle beat him to it. I'm leaving, Doc. To Jan he said, I have to go, but I'll be back. Letting go of his hand, Jan reached up and stroked Kyle's face. I know you will. With a last, long look into her face, Kyle turned round and left the room. Jan watched him go until the curtains hid him from view. She heard the sickbay doors open and close as he passed through. Turning her attention back to the doctor, She saw that Berth was smiling at her, a knowing smile. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, the smile fading away. Jan didn't believe him, but decided pursuing the matter wasn't worth it. Besides, she had a more important question on her mind. "All right, then let me ask you this. How soon before I can get out of here?" "Well, your latest series of tests all look good and your injury is healing nicely. How about you stay here for one more night and I'll discharge you first thing in the morning?" Jan considered that for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." "Good," Berth said, turning to leave. "I do have one other request," Jan said. The doctor turned back around. "And that is, would it be possible to get a portable holo projector and a copy of the footage from the battle Kyle and I were yesterday?" "I'll have to check with Plaston first." "May I ask why?" "Something happened to Kyle during the battle, doctor. I don't know what, but it's obviously bothering him. I want to know what happened." Berth took a moment to think it over, then nodded. "Let me call Plaston and see what he says." "Thanks," Jan said as the doctor exited the room. "Jan," he called softly. She didn't move. "Jan," he called, a bit louder this time. She stirred slightly, but with a sigh, went on sleeping. Reaching over to the bed, he gave it a small shake. Jan's eyes snapped open and she exhaled in a kind of snort. Her eyes cast about, taking in the scene around her. She spotted him sitting by the foot of the bed. "Kyle," she croaked, throat dry. "Time to wake up, Miss Orrs." Pushing herself up, blinking sleep from her eyes, Jan reached for the bedside control, raising the head of it so she could see him better. She started to reach for the ever-present glass of water at the table. "Here," Kyle said, holding it out to her. Gratefully accepting the glass, Jan took a sip, one eye on Kyle as she did so. He was smiling at her, and while it didn't bother her in the least, she wondered at the reason for his smile. She started to set the glass back down only to have Kyle intercept it. "Good morning," she said. "More like good afternoon," he said. "What?" He checked his chronometer. "At the tone, the time will be," he paused, 1,215 hours. He paused again, then added, "Beep." "No," Jan protested. "I couldn't have slept that long." Kyle put up a hand to stop her. "Doc told me you were up almost half the night there reviewing that." He nodded towards the holo projector. "I'd guess you have some questions." Jan nodded, about to ask one of the many questions when he interrupted her again. "But before we begin that, I thought you might like to accompany me to the mess hall." "But my discharge." "Oh, that," Kyle said dismissively, "already taken care of. So, what do you say, Miss Orrs?" He held out a hand to her. Jan stared at him for a long moment. Few men could surprise her as Kyle did. She smiled at him, taking his hand in hers. "I'd say give me 10 minutes to shower and change and you have a date, Mr. Katarn." The doors to the mess hall parted before them. They automatically let go of each other's hands. As Jan had told him, their relationship was their business and no one else's. But in order to avoid unwanted questions or rumors, they decided to keep their interactions for non-public venues only. "Thank you for this, Kyle," Jan said, taking a sniff of the aromas wafting from the kitchen. "Dr. Burt tries, but sickbay food is a poor substitute for the real thing." "No problem," he said. "I'm just glad to have you up and around. Dealing with what happened during the battle has been hard enough without you to talk to." "Well," Jan said, flattered, "I do believe that was a compliment, Mr. Katarn." "As it was intended to be, Miss Orrs," he said. They smiled at each other, then turned their attention to the selections of food. They sat across from each other on one end of the room's long tables, the buzz of conversation and clinking dishware all about them. "So," Kyle said, after swallowing a bite of salad, "where do you want to begin?" "Well, first off, how much do you remember after the Thai wreckage hit us?" "Not much." "Jan!" "Hey, Jan!" Jan looked up at the sound, and Kyle turned to look over his shoulder. Coming across the room, waving at them, was Alessa. Galder and Wexter were in line getting food, but waved as well. Kyle and Jan acknowledged with waves of their own. I guess we'll have to talk about this later, Kyle. Yeah, he said, a tinge of disappointment in his voice. Alessa reached the table just as Jan stood up to greet her. The raven-haired woman threw her arms about Jan. We just went by sickbay to see you, but you weren't there. Dr. Berth told us you had been discharged. Are you all right? Just fine, Jan said, stepping back as Alessa released her from the hug. How'd you find us? Oh, Alessa said, pausing a moment before answering. That nice doctor told us you might be heading her. So we took a chance, and here we are. Hope it's okay if we join you, Wexter said, stepping up behind the women with a tray full of food. Of course it is, Jan said. I was going to come see you later, but now's as good a time as any. Kyle didn't say anything, although he thought it was a bit presumptuous of Jan to assume she could speak for the both of them. Still, it was her friends. Friends she had thought dead. If he were in her place and someone he had known from Sulin had survived, he'd probably act the same way. However, he couldn't help but feel a bit rankled when Galder and Wexter took seats on either side of Jan, leaving Alessa to sit by him. He was also trying to remember if he had said anything to Berth about his lunch plans with Jan. As best as he could recall, they hadn't discussed it. Jan and the two men began to talk to each other, sharing stories of their history together in Alderaan. Thinking Alessa would join in, it caught Kyle by surprise when she spoke to him. So Kyle, you knew where we're from. How about you? Me? He said, turning to look at her. Is there anyone else with the name Kyle sitting here? She teased. He chuckled. No, I suppose not. So tell me where you're from, she prompted, gazing at him with interest. Sure, he said. My home world is called Sulin. It's an outer rim world, pretty much out of the way of most of the major space lanes. What it's like? When I was little, I thought it was the greatest planet in the galaxy. Sulin was an agrarian world, primarily used for farming. My father had a big place, miles and miles of low hills and flat plains. In the growing season, the fields would change color with the crops we had planted. There was a time when I thought that I'd be just like my father, a farmer. But that was before the Empire, she ventured. Exactly, Kyle replied, nodding. Of all the planets in the galaxy, you'd wonder why the Empire would even waste the time on Sulin. We had no major weapons or fighting craft. Heck, the only weapons we had were hand blasters we used to scare off predators. So what happened to Sulin? Well, you have to realize that while most of this was going on, I was at the Imperial Academy on Karita. I didn't learn about most of what happened to Sulin until fairly recently. I remember Jan told us you used to be a stormtrooper. Yep, Kyle said, half smiling at the memory. I sure was. One of the Emperor's good little soldiers. Suddenly, from the other side of the table, Galder spoke up. So what happened? Caught off guard, Kyle hesitated a moment, then said, Excuse me. We didn't really get into the details of why you left the Empire for the rebellion when we talking yesterday. I was curious as to what happened. Kyle looked down at his tray for a moment. It's not a pleasant memory, Galder. I'd just as soon not discuss it. Then don't, Alessa said kindly. Let's talk more about Sulin. Tell me. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, Kyle, Galder said, but from what I know of the Empire, they don't just let anyone walk away for no reason. You know that I defected, Kyle said, still looking down. Drop it, Galder, he thought. I don't want to talk about this. He was beginning to get angry. Come on, Galder, Wexter said. Leave the kid alone. That's right, Alessa joined in. Besides, we were talking, and you're interrupting. Kyle noticed that Jan wasn't saying anything. Why not? Why doesn't she tell him to back off? The anger was getting worse. If Galder didn't back off soon. But the man continued as if Wexter and Alessa hadn't spoken. Yes, I do know you defected. But as I said before, I'm curious as to why. The Empire doesn't. A fist struck the table, rattling the dishes and glassware. Kyle looked up at Galder, his eyes smoldering with anger. You want to know what happened? Fine, I'll tell you. While I was at the Imperial Academy, the Empire invaded my home world. When the people resisted, the Empire sent in stormtroopers disguised as rebels and systematically slaughtered all resistance. My father was captured, interrogated, then killed. But that wasn't enough. Oh no, the Empire had to make an example out of Sulin. So they cut off the heads of the resistance leaders and stuck them on spikes outside the spaceport. One of the heads put there was my father's. That's why I defected and came to the rebellion. Is that clear enough for you? As the last of his words died away, Kyle realized he was breathing heavily. Around him, the entire mess had gone silent, faces all over the room staring at him. Galder was staring at him wide-eyed, clearing stunned by Kyle's words. Wexter was looking down at his plate, slowly shaking his head. He looked to Jan, who was staring at him with an expression of profound sorrow. To his right, Alessa had the same look. His emotions beginning to overcome him, Kyle stood up fast. If you'll all please excuse me. Without another word, he strode to the mess hall doors, nearly every eye in the place watching him until the closing doors cut him off from view. Gradually, conversations resumed in the room, replacing the oppressive silence. Satisfied, Jan said angrily, her expression a match for the tone in her voice. Still stunned, Galder tried to speak. I had no idea. I told you to back off the kid, Wexter said. But I didn't mean. But nothing, Galder, Alessa said, equally angry. Kyle told you he didn't want to discuss the matter. But you had to keep pushing, and now look what's happened. Not to mention the scene you caused. But I didn't mean to, Galder protested. Honestly, had I any inkling of his past, I never would have. Which is why you should have listened when Kyle asked not to discuss it, Alessa cut in, but you went ahead anyway. You're so blasted bullheaded at times. Galder started to stand. Let me go after him. I'll apologize. I wouldn't do that, Jan said. What? Wexter and Alessa said together. But Jan, I've obviously offended the man. I should. You've already done enough, Galder, Jan said. Don't make things worse by going after him. But Jan, Alessa protested, he should at least apologize. I agree, but not now. Right now, Kyle is too upset to listen. And if you went near him right now, Galder, I'd be surprised if he didn't deck you. He looked at her with an expression that said he wouldn't let Kyle do that. Fine, Jan said, shrugging. Don't believe me. But unless you're willing to find out, I'd suggest you stay here for the moment. His mood changing in an instant, Galder smiled at her, moving to drape an arm across her shoulders. Well, he said, if you insist, I suppose that wouldn't be too unpleasant. Jan's face clouded. You never give up, do you? Well, forget it. Raising her right arm, she jabbed backward with the elbow. Both Wexter and Alessa fought not to laugh at the look of surprise on Galder's face as he yelped in pain. I'll see you three later, Jan said, pushing back from the table and standing up. I'm sorry, Alessa offered. Not your fault, Jan said, turning her gaze on Galder. Don't follow me. Turning on her heel, she walked to the mess hall doors, disappearing as they closed behind her. Maybe we should leave now, Galder, Wexter said. At this rate, you're going to get us kicked off the ship before morning. Back off, Wexter, Galder said, his embarrassment turning to anger. He's right, Galder, Alessa said. You're acting like we're still on Alderaan and things are still like they were. But they aren't. I know that, Alessa. Then start acting like it before you ruin whatever chance you think you have. Some of the bluster and anger left Galder, and he slumped in his seat. There's a time and place for everything, Galder, Wexter offered. You just have to be patient and wait. Galder seemed to mull that over for a moment. His eyes suddenly brightened, and he pushed back from the table. What are you doing? Alessa asked as Galder stood. You're right, Alessa. Both you and Wexter. And I'm going to start by setting things right with Jan and then with Kyle. He turned from the table, moving towards the doors. Watching him go, Wexter looked to Alessa. Should we go after him? Shaking her head, Alessa turned back to her food. I'm tired of chasing after him. He's on his own this time. The hangar bay? expecting to find Kyle working on the Moldy Crow. Jan was surprised to see no activity around the ship as she approached, although the cockpit was open. She moved towards the cockpit. "Kyle," she called. From inside, she heard him call back, "Over here." Stepping up the side of the ship, Jan leaned over the edge of the cockpit. Kyle was seated in the front couch, hands behind his head, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Hi," she offered. "Hi," he said, head turning to face her. "I have to say I'm surprised, Kyle. I thought I'd find you working." "I was going to when I got here," he said, "but it just didn't. I dunno, Jan, for some reason, I climbed in here and started taking inventory of the ceiling." "Inventory," she said, chuckling. "Yeah," he replied, pointing towards the ceiling. "See the conduit right there." Jan tried to see where he was pointing, but couldn't identify the area. "Right there," Kyle prompted, the small one between the two larger ones. Jan looked again, not seeing. There it was. "Okay, I see it." "Well, that conduit travels from that wall over there," he said, pointing to the far corner, to almost midways across the ceiling, then turns 90 degrees, passing right here over the ship and into the wall again. "Well," Jan said, "that's something else. Look, Kyle, I'm sorry about Galder." "It's okay," he said, too quickly. "No, it's not." "Jan, really, I'm not." "Look at me, Katarn." "Oh," he thought. For a moment, he thought about refusing, but that wouldn't work with her. Taking a deep breath, he turned to look at her, almost recoiling. Jan had pulled herself the rest of the way up and was sitting on the lip of the cockpit, using her hands to steady herself. She had leaned in closer, her face inches away. The sound of the hangar bay doors opening was lost to both of them as they gazed into each other's eyes. "It's not okay," she said softly, but clearly emphasizing each word. Kyle couldn't deny the force behind them. He nodded. "Good," she said, pulling back a bit, but still staring right at him. "For what it's worth, he doesn't intend to apologize. And 3 of us let him have it after you left." Kyle chuckled, wondering what exactly had happened after he had left the mess hall. He could only imagine. "Thanks," he said. "Not necessary," she said. "Beside, Galder's more harmless than he looks. Back on Alderaan, he put his foot in his mouth more times than I can count. Just give him a chance. He's not really a bad guy." "I suppose," Kyle said. "What do you mean by that?" He shrugged at her, saying, "I'm not sure. I just don't like the guy." "What?" Jan asked, taken aback by Kyle's response. "Why?" He shrugged again. "The way he greeted me in sickbay." "What are you talking about, Katarn?" She was using his last name? Never a good sign. "Well, when we shook hands, it was like he was trying to crush my—" Jan gave a dismissive wave. He didn't mean anything by it. Galder's sometimes just a little self-conscious, and he does that to try and assert his dominance or something like that. He wasn't trying to hurt you? Well, it didn't feel like that. "And let me guess," Jan said sarcastically, "you probably squeezed back." "You're blasted right I did. Whatever game he was playing, I didn't like it." "What is it with you guys?" Jan exclaimed. "Get more than 2 of you in a room, and you have to stake out your territory." "Excuse me?" Kyle said, his own voice rising. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that because Galder gave your hand a little squeeze, suddenly he's a bad guy." "It wasn't just that," Kyle protested. "You saw how he kept digging at my past in the mess hall. And he's sorry for doing that, Kyle." Jan admitted, "But it's not like he meant to upset you. You just have to give him a chance." "He's your friend, Jan, not mine." "That's right, Kyle. Galder is my friend. And so are Lessa and Wexter. And I expect you to treat them with courtesy and respect." "Hey, I don't have a problem with the Lessa or Wexter. As for Galder, he'd better stay out of my way." "Or what?" His glare provided the answer. "Can you hear yourself, Kyle? You know my friends for less than a day, and you've already decided Galder is a bad guy. And why? Because he's made one simple mistake. And I won't give him the chance to make any more." Jan rolled her eyes, shaking her head at him, completely exasperated. I'm not going to sit here and listen to any more of this. Fine, Kyle said, returning his gaze to the ceiling. Fine. I don't why you're acting like this, Kyle. But you'd better stay away from Galder. You understand me? No problem, he shot back. Eyes flaming, face set in a mask of anger, Jan walked to the hangar bay entrance. Part of her mind registered the sound of the doors opening and closing, but she was too upset to think anything more of it. I can't believe I even wasted time coming down here. What is wrong with Kyle anyway? He's being so pig-headed. He can't see how ridiculous he's being. Galder can be a jerk, but he would never knowingly hurt anyone. I know him better than that. Hiding in the shadows a short distance away, Galder listened intently to the conversation. Clearly, Katarn was going to be a problem. For whatever ridiculous reason, Jan seemed to have feelings for him. Galder shook his head, surprised that Jan would choose someone like Katarn. Such a thing never would have happened back on Alderaan. When she mentioned about her and the other letting him have it, he wondered if perhaps this was a waste of time. If Jan had chosen Katarn, then there was very little Galder could do to change her mind. He was thinking about leaving when he heard Jan say to Katarn, just give him a chance. He's not really a bad guy. He didn't hear the answer, but Jan's tone had changed. He listened more, able to tell that Jan was getting annoyed. No, he decided, more than annoyed, she was getting angry. And angry with Katarn. Galder smiled in the darkness as he listened to the two of them argue back and forth, their voices getting louder and louder. When Jan said, I'm not going to sit here and listen to any more of this, he was practically beaming. He had his chance and was going to take full advantage of it. Moving as quickly as he could without making too much noise, Galder rushed to the hangar bay doors, passing through them and down the corridor until he found a turn in it. He moved around the corner, flattening him against the wall and listening for footsteps. Jan stalked down the corridor, eyes open but not really seeing anything. Her argument with Kyle kept replaying in her head. She couldn't understand why he was acting like this. It just wasn't him. So focused on the images in her mind, she didn't notice the other person coming the opposite way down the corridor. Whoa. Look out, he called. Jan raised her head to see Galder standing right in front of her. She was about to walk right into him. She tried to avoid the collision, leaning to her right, but her foot slipped and with a cry, she fell towards the deck. A pair of strong hands caught her. Whoa. Easy there, Jan. She looked up into his face. Galder. Moving carefully, he helped Jan back onto her feet. You all right? I think so, she said, feeling a bit shaken from the near fall. Thanks. Guess I wasn't watching where I was going. It's okay. I catch you anytime, anywhere. Whoa, she said, holding up a hand, back off the thrusters there, Galder. He moved back a step, looked at the deck for a moment, then back at her. Sorry, Jan, I didn't mean anything. Just reliving old memories. Well, just remember their memories, okay? Now, what are you doing here? Galder's eyes dropped down to the deck again. Well, to tell the truth, I was looking for you. Oh. Raising his head to look at her again, Galder's expression showed honest regret. I wanted to say again that I'm sorry for shooting my mouth off earlier. I didn't mean to hurt either you or Kyle. Well, you didn't hurt me, Jan replied. I can't speak for Kyle. But you've got to remember, Galder, things are different now. I know, he said. It's just that, seeing you again, having thought you were dead. Well, as I said earlier, it's brought back a lot of memories. Good memories. It was Jan's turn to look at the deck. She had been worried about this ever since she had seen Galder here aboard the New Hope. Nearly a minute passed before she was able to speak. Galder, look, I won't deny that what we had was special. You made me feel like a princess back then, and I loved you for it. But when the war came, and you joined those on the council that opposed Alderaan offering assistance to the rebellion, it created a rift between us. I remember, Galder said, smiling at her, but Jan, please understand that I did what I thought was right for Alderaan, Jan, the Empire was the legal authority in the galaxy, and the rebellion was opposing that authority. Alderaan had never supported outlaws against the legal authority before. It seemed like the obvious decision. "Oh, please," she said. "You were so mired in upholding the traditions of Alderaan and our neutrality. You couldn't see the Empire for what it was, a dictatorship with no respect for individual freedom." They stared at each other for a moment, then burst out laughing. I can't believe we're doing this, Jan thought. She and Galder had fallen so easily into their old roles, arguing over the true purposes of the Empire and the rebellion. How many times did we fight over this? It seemed like only yesterday. Well, Galder said, still chuckling, I can see you've lost none of that intensity I so admired. Are you? Jan replied. I had forgotten how stubborn you could be. Only when I thought I was right. Which you always did. He smiled at her, the years apart melting away. I can't truly say that I've missed you, Jan. I suppose I've missed you too, Galder. And I am glad you're alive. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Jan opened her arms to him. Galder waited a moment, unsure. But when she nodded, he stepped forward, encircling her with his own arms. They hugged each other, the rift between them sealed, if only for that moment. Even as she luxuriated in Galder's embrace, Jan's brain was screaming at her. What are you doing? Have you forgotten what this guy did to you? Planet Alderaan spaceport time 1.6 years ago, another magnificent sunset cast its remaining rays of light across the spaceport, casting alternating bands of light and shadow on the circular pads. On one of them sat a Corellian corvette. Evidence of the ship's age was clear in the faded paint as well as dents and burns on the hull. This was a ship that had seen combat before. Two figures stood by the ship, facing each other. A large travel pack lay on the ground near one of them. Don't do this, Jan. I told you before, Galder. I've made up my mind. I don't understand this, Jan. The rebellion is fighting to destabilize the order that the Empire has created. I don't see how you want to be a part of that. Jan shook her head, not believing they were going over the same ground again. Galder, I know you have faith in the Empire and what it stands for. There was a time I felt the same, but not anymore. He let out an exasperated sigh. This is all about that incident at Gorman, isn't it? It's a big part of it, Jan admitted. Jan, he said, his tone placating. What happened on Gorman was a terrible tragedy, but it was not the Empire's fault. The captain of the landing ship ordered the people off the landing pad. And when they didn't move, Jan cut in. He activated his repulsors and landed anyway, killing nearly everyone there. They were given a chance. I don't see how you can blame the Empire for. I just can't believe you, Galder. The captain of the Imperial ship didn't even offer an apology for his actions. And he was promoted. Explain to me how killing innocent civilians warrants a promotion. We don't know they were all so innocent, Jan. There were reports that some of those civilians were armed. See? This is exactly what I mean, Galder. You see what the Empire has done, and yet, you excuse their behavior. How can you have such blind faith in something so obviously corrupt? Because the Empire is trying to bring peace to the galaxy, Jan, and if there's any corruption, it's because of the rebellion and its leaders. They attack Imperial convoys and steal the cargoes. They send spies into Imperial space and sabotage the space yards. They even corrupt the hearts and minds of loyal Imperials and turn them into traitors. Then I guess they've corrupted me as well, Galder. Because I believe in what the rebellion is doing. And that's why I'm leaving. And if you were the man I once believed you to be, you come with me. So now you're going to try and use the love I feel for you to make me turn my back on everything I believe in. No, Galder, I won't do that. But I can't let my love for you blind me to what is right and what isn't. All right, let's just suppose for a moment that you're right. I still don't understand why you're leaving. You could stay here on Alderaan and still help the rebellion. No, Jan said, I can't. And you know why. Because of my opposition to Alderaan aiding the rebellion. Jan nodded. The king has made his decision, Jan, and I have no doubt it was the right decision. For Alderaan to sacrifice its neutrality would severely damage, if not destroy, our relationship with the Empire. Why can't you accept the decision and stay? Because Alderaan's neutrality has become a farce, Galder. The war between the Empire and the Rebellion has begun, and one day, we will have to pick a side. No, Galder said, shaking his head. You're wrong, Jan. Maybe I am, she admitted, but what if I'm right? You won't even consider it? Because it doesn't make any sense. Yes, it does, Galder. Yes, it does. I can only hope that someday you'll see the truth. I see the truth, Jan, he said strongly, but your truth is not mine. His words cut into her deeply. It was a repudiation of everything she thought, felt, and believed in. Galder couldn't have hurt her worse if he had physically struck her. Jan's face grew hot and she felt the sting of tears in her eyes. Time to go, she thought, before I lose my nerve. Reaching down, she hefted the travel pack onto one shoulder. Galder watched her, his expression disapproving. I've got to go, Jan said. He didn't reply. I love you, Galder. No, Jan, he said defiantly. I don't think you do. What? She exclaimed. If you truly loved me, you'd abandon this foolishness and stay here. I know we could work this out somehow, but as it seems you won't, then I have to believe that you don't love me. The tears came. She couldn't stop them. She couldn't believe this was happening. Could he really mean what he was saying? Galder, she began. Goodbye, Jan. With that, Galder turned his back on her and walked away. Jan stood there watching him go, unable to move. She didn't know how much longer she had stood there after Galder had disappeared from view. But when the footsteps came from behind her, the sun had set and the stars had come out. We need to go, Jan, said a voice from behind her. She nodded, unable to speak. As the footsteps started moving away, Jan took a deep breath, forcing herself to concentrate despite the ache in her heart. She quickly wiped at her eyes, turned round and followed the man onto the waiting ship. Jan couldn't deny the reality of what Galder had done to her. But here, at this moment, she couldn't help but feel thankful that he hadn't been killed with the millions of others on Alderaan. As they hugged, Jan felt movement across her upper back, then lower, and then even lower. Move it or I'll break it, Galder, she said in a warning tone. Letting go of him, she stepped back, out of the embrace. Galder's expression was that of a child caught with his hand caught in the cookie jar. Can't blame a guy for trying, he said. Well, don't try it again. Understand? He nodded. At least, not without asking, okay. Galder's answering was accompanied by a wide smile. What am I doing? Jan thought. I'm actually flirting with him. This, the guy who rejected and walked away from me, and I'm flirting with him. What would Kyle think if he saw this? At that, Jan relived the argument she had just had with Kyle. Why should I care what he thinks? It's like he owns me or I have any claim on him. Even as she thought this, Jan remembered their time together in Kyle's quarters. The kiss. Okay, maybe I do care about him, but he's got to understand that I have other friends, and he has to treat them with respect. He's blowing the whole incident with Galder out of proportion, I'm sure. And if he's going to keep acting like a pig-headed jerk, then maybe we need to stay away from each other for a while. Jan nodded to herself, the decision made. Listen, Galder said, motioning to the lift behind him, I'd better get back to the mess hall before Lessa and Wexter start wondering where I am. Okay, Jan said. I guess we'll see you later, then. Count on it, Jan said, smiling at him. We still have a lot of catching up to do. Good, he said, turning to leave. As Galder started up the hall, Jan realized that after what had just happened, she really didn't want to be alone. And while there was a solution to that problem, part of her wondered if she was stepping in where she ought not to tread. Galder, wait a moment. He halted, turned back to face her. Yes. I've been meaning to ask, how did the three of you get here? Oh, he said, a bit surprised. I thought we had explained that earlier. When? Jan said, brows drawing together in confusion. Back in sickbay, when we were telling you how we escaped the destruction of Alderaan. Of course, Jan said, snapping her fingers, Alessa's new ship. Exactly? Did you say what kind of ship it is? Galder mused, I don't think so. So, what is it? Actually, a very nice ship. One of the latest luxury yachts, the Sarasub 3000. Jan thought for a moment, then said, haven't heard the name before. It's quite a ship, Jan. It has 2 decks with the lower containing cabins for the pilot and up to 4 passengers. Alessa had most of the upper deck set up as an oversized observation area. She even found space in the nose to create a small ballroom to entertain guests. What kind of power plant? Galder shrugged. I really don't know. Some kind of ion drive. Wexter would be the one to ask about that. He spent more time with it than anyone except maybe for the people who built it. I wouldn't mind seeing it sometime. Well, how about now? We could go to the mess hall and ask Alessa. Jan smiled. I'd like that. Lead the way, Galder said, waving his arm in a grand gesture. Uh-huh, Jan said, like I'm going to fall for that one. You first, Galder. Smiling briefly, he turned his back to her and started up the corridor. As they stepped into the lift, Galder smiled to himself. This was going perfectly. He could see Jan still cared for him. All he had to do now was keep Katarn from messing things up, and he'd have what he wanted. They found Wexter and Alessa still in the mess hall, picking at the remains of their food. Deep in conversation with each other, they didn't notice Jan and Galder until the pair had almost reached the table. Alessa caught sight of them. She motioned to Wexter, who turned round in his seat to see Jan and Galder. They're together, Alessa thought. She watched Galder's face and the confident smile he wore. Something's happened. After what he did to her back on Alderaan, how is it they're together now? She could see Wexter shared her surprise at seeing Jan and Galder together. Alessa spoke first. Well, there you are. Wexter and I were wondering if we needed to go looking for you too. No need of that, Alessa, Galder said. As you can see, we're back. You okay, Jan? Wexter asked. She smiled at him. Of course I am, Wexter. Why do you ask? Well, given what happened here. Oh, that, she said dismissively, is taken care of. Really? Alessa said, her tone disbelieving. Yes, really, Alessa, Jan said, raising an eyebrow. Why? Is there a problem? Well, I noticed Kyle didn't come back with you. Alessa saw her friend's face cloud. So that was it. She and Kyle must have had a fight. Kyle is being, Jan started to say, but Galder cut her off. Kyle is upset over the incident between he and I. As soon as he calms down, I intend to apologize. It's perfectly natural, and I... Jan jumped in, letting the anger she felt come out in her words. Kyle is being a ridiculously stubborn, nerve-hurting jerk. I tried to explain to him that Galder didn't mean to make him mad earlier, and what does he say? I don't like him. He doesn't even know Galder. I don't understand how he can make such an arbitrary judgment over a single incident. It was more than an incident, Jan, Wexter said. Galder kept at it even after Kyle asked him to back off. I made a mistake, Wexter, Galder said. That's all. And as I said, I'm willing to apologize. Listen to him, Alessa thought. He's trying to justify his behavior as a simple mistake. Well, I'm not letting him get away with it. Looking into her brother's eyes, Alessa spoke. Stop trying to turn this into something less than it was, Galder. You know as well as I do that if you had just left Kyle alone in the first place, none of this would have happened. To Alessa's surprise, it wasn't Galder who responded, but Jan. Why don't you back off Galder, Alessa? He knows he was wrong and wants to make good. That should be enough. For pity's sake, you sound just like Kyle. Alessa was about to deliver a retort when Galder spoke up. This is getting us nowhere. Besides, the problem is between Kyle and myself, and I will deal with it in time. Alessa knew she could pursue this further, and likely get Galder to admit the truth of what he had done. But she didn't like the way Jan was reacting. Her friend was looking at her with an expression that bordered on anger. If she continued, what would it do to their friendship? All right, Galder, she thought. You win this round. To the two of them she said, very well. Across from her, Wexter's eyes went wide and he stared straight at Alessa. She looked at him out of the corner of her eye, gave a small shake of her head. Wexter looked up, seeing the flint in Jan's eyes. He had known her for many years and knew that look well. She was getting angry. What he didn't understand was why. What had happened between her and Kyle that Jan would take Galder's side, especially when it was so clear that the fault was clearly his. For the moment, he'd have to trust Alessa's judgment. The reason we came here, Galder continued, was to invite you two to accompany Jan and myself to the hangar bay. I've invited Jan to come take a look at the Aldera. Jan's face changed almost immediately, a smile coming to her face. The Aldera? Alessa couldn't help but smile as she thought of how she had decided on that name. I wanted something to connect the ship with home. Now it serves to remind me of Aldrin. It's a good name, Alessa, Jan said with emphasis. Thank you. It certainly is. Which is another reason I'd like Jan to see the ship. Alessa. It took a moment before Alessa snapped out of her reverie. Oh, yes, of course. If you'd like to see the ship, Jan? Definitely. Let's go, Galder said, turning round and heading for the door, Jan trailing in his wake. Wexter and Alessa got up from the table and moved after them. Something's not right, Wexter said. Why is Jan acting like this? I don't know. Maybe if we can find Kyle later, we can get his perspective on things. You don't think Galder would? Wexter trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished but the meaning clear. I hope not, Wexter. For his sake and for hers, I truly hope not. Kyle sat in the cockpit of the Moldy Crow, trying to relax, but the argument he had had with Jan kept replaying itself over and over again in his mind. How had things gone from so happy to so bad so quickly? One minute he was staring into her eyes, wondering if she would kiss him again. The next they were arguing. Am I overreacting? It's true I don't know Galder well at all. Heck, I've known the guy for less than a day. Maybe Jan's right and he didn't mean anything by the handshake and what happened in the mess. I could give the guy a chance to apologize and make good. And I would like the chance to talk to Alessa and Wexter some more. And there was Jan to consider. Kyle wasn't exactly sure what he felt for her. Is it love? Maybe. I do know that I care about her, and as much as I want to pretend I don't care what she thinks of me, I do care. His decision made, Kyle sat up and extricated himself from the cockpit, heading for the hangar bay doors. There's just one problem with this, he thought. I have no idea where she is. Oh well, the New Hope is only so big. I'll find her eventually. He had just about reached the doors when they opened. Kyle found himself smiling as Jan walked in, followed by Galder, Alessa, and Wexter. He waved at them. Hi. Alessa stepped over to where he was, Wexter trailing her. Jan and Galder, however, kept walking. Hey there, Kyle, Wexter said. Listen, about earlier. Hold that thought, Wexter. Raising his voice, Kyle called out. Galder. To his surprise, they kept walking. Kyle began to walk towards them. He called out again. Hey, Galder. Hold up a moment. Still no reaction. Okay, he thought. Guess I have to this the hard way. He set off at a run, catching up to them quickly. Moving in front of them, Kyle stopped. I need to speak with you, Galder. For a moment, it seemed like they were going to run right into him. But then Jan reached out, touching Galder softly on the arm. They came to a halt, facing Kyle, saying nothing. Okay, the first move is mine then. Galder, about what happened in the mess hall, I heard you very clearly, Katarn, the man said, interrupting, and I apologize if anything I said offended you. Galder, as I recall, I asked you to not pursue the conversation, but you kept pushing. Yes. Kyle felt confused. This wasn't going at all like he expected. And I wanted to explain to you why I went off like that. Wait a minute, Kyle thought. That's not right. Why do I sound like I'm apologizing to this guy? You need explain anything, Katarn. And in order to prevent further such outbursts, I think it's best if we stay away from each other. Wait a minute, Kyle said. Galder, that's not it. Listen, I wanted to. Forgive me, Katarn. But I really don't care what you want. Now, if you'll excuse me. Jan, help me out here. Tell him what I'm trying to say. I think things are perfectly clear, Katarn, she said, her face set in a neutral expression. Galder has apologized and you've accepted. I don't see what else needs to be said. But, Jan, he sputtered, I wanted to tell you about earlier. I heard what you had to say, Katarn. You made your feelings abundantly clear. And I don't see a need to continue that conversation, do you? Well, no, but... Good. Now, if you would please move. Kyle didn't know what to think or say. Everything seemed to be crumbling about him. What else was there to do? If that's what you want. It is, she said. Kyle stepped back and turned, allowing them a clear path. Sudden pain blossomed as Galder hit him shoulder to shoulder as he and Jan passed. Fresh anger rose within Kyle. He clenched his fist as Galder and Jan moved away. He had been right. There was something wrong with Galder. He didn't know what, but his dislike of the man intensified. At the same time, there was an aching chest at what Jan had said. Granted, they had argued and she had stormed off, but she always listened to him before, giving him another chance. What had just happened? Had he blown it with her? No, it couldn't be. Jan was his friend, and maybe more. But right now, it felt like anything but. Feeling even worse than he had after Jan had left him in the Crow, he turned and walked back towards where Wexter and Alessa were standing. How'd it go? Wexter asked. Not well, I'd imagine, Alessa said, seeing Kyle's dejected expression. No, Kyle agreed, not well. Not well at all. If you don't mind us asking, Alessa ventured, what happened? I'm kind of wondering that myself, Kyle replied. He went on to explain coming down here after leaving the mess hall. I was sitting in the cockpit staring at the ceiling when I heard Jan calling me. We started talking, and the next thing I knew, we were fighting. Over what happened with Galder. Alessa ventured. Exactly, Kyle said, staring intently at her. How'd you know? Alessa filled him in on Jan's and Galder's appearances back in the mess hall and the conversation between the four of them. Well, that explains a lot, Kyle said when she had finished. When I saw you all come in, I was on my way to find Jan and apologize, tell her that I'd give Galder a chance. But she's obviously still too mad to listen to me. But I'm surprised at how she acted towards you too. That's not like her. You're telling us, said Wexter. I'm half tempted to corner her and demand an explanation for her behavior. Not a good idea, Kyle and Alessa said at the same time. They stared at each for a moment with looks of surprise. The looks turned into smiles and finally laughter at how they had both thought the same thing. Sounds like you've gotten to know well, Alessa said, still smiling. Probably not as well as you, Kyle admitted, but enough to know when to leave her alone. Well, consider yourself lucky, Wexter said. At least she hasn't decked you. Actually, Kyle said, a little embarrassed, she has. No, Alessa said, incredulous. Kyle said, nodding. Right after a mission, in fact. What happened? Wexter asked. It's a long story, Kyle said, thinking back to that day. I'd like to hear it, the older man said. As would I, echoed Alessa. Well, I suppose I have the time, Kyle replied, but do you think it's safe to leave the two of them alone? Normally I'd say yes, Alessa said, but given what's today, maybe we'd better follow them. Besides, it'll give you a chance to see my ship, Kyle. Oh yeah, he asked, intrigued. What kind? A Sarasu luxury yacht, Wexter said, his voice growing excited as he began describing the ship, 3000 class. It's got twin engine pods, 2 decks, full cabins, even A. Wexter, Alessa interrupted, don't you think it'd be easier to show Kyle the ship than just tell him about it? You're right, Alessa. Sorry, Kyle. I get a bit carried away sometimes. You'll see it's quite a ship. Now I'm definitely interested. Let's go. With Alessa in the lead and Wexter walking next to Kyle, the trio made their way over to the Aldera's berth. And this was the forward observation area. But as you can see, Alessa changed it just a bit. Stepping out of the elevator, Jan stepped onto more of the deep pile carpet. Cast in a rich mix of orange and brown, it reminded her of walking on a beach at sunset. But it was only the precursors to what was before her now. A wall about 10 feet to her right moved in a gentle line, curving out of sight some distance ahead. Chandeliers of opalescent crystal dotted the ceiling, casting largest cones of light about the room. I don't see any chains or hooks, she said. What's holding them up? Believe it or not, Galder said. Small repulse Orloff's generators. You can move them anywhere about the room, even change the height. Moving to a wall console, he pressed a button. As Jan watched in fascination, the chandeliers began to move, sliding across the ceiling to different positions. A few dropped towards the floor, creating smaller cones of light. Wow. We've a set of pre-programmed settings, or we can manipulate them one by one. But what about tables and chairs? Jan asked, gesturing at the room. You're not exactly set up for anything. We had planned to, Galder said, but what with the problems with the engines, the repulsors and the Navi computer, decorating quickly became a secondary concern. Sounds like a lot going wrong for such a new ship. Are you sure Alessa didn't get a reject from the boneyard? For a while, Galder said, nodding, we were thinking exactly that. It frustrated Wexter to no end. He'd fix one system and another would malfunction. By the time he fixed that one, the first one he had fixed would be having problems. Jan looked around her, feeling a bit nervous. She didn't like the idea of random malfunctions. Did you ever find out what was wrong? Oh yes, Galder said, seeing a flicker in her eyes. Wexter had been running tests on the main computer and finally discovered the source of all the problems. And Jan prompted. Turns out the main computer on this ship came from another vessel. Unfortunately, when it was installed, the original programs were still in memory. So we had a Saraswab yacht trying to run programs intended for a Corellian freighter. Jan stared at him for a moment in disbelief, then burst out laughing. You've got to be kidding me. Galder shook his head. It's the truth. Ask Wexter if you want. Ask me what? Came a voice from behind them. They turned to see Alessa and Wexter standing behind them. Kyle was there too, but hadn't exited the elevator. As if a switch had been turned to off, Jan stopped laughing, her smile replaced by a look that wasn't exactly hostile, but nowhere near friendly. Ask me what? Wexter prompted. I was telling Jan how you discovered that Aldera's main computer had originally come from a Corellian freighter, and that his programs were causing all those early problems. Ah, Wexter exclaimed, I still can't believe those fat-headed engineers made such a mistake. Anyone with half a brain knows you always erase all existing computer memory before installation. Well, it's a good thing you figured it out, Wexter, Galder said. Yes, Jan said, tonelessly, a good thing. That was it for Wexter. In 3 quick steps, he was almost nose to nose with Jan. All right, Missy. I've had just about all I'm going to take. An hour ago, you were all sunshine and smiles. Now, you're being downright rude, and I want to know why. Jan didn't answer. You look at me when I talk you, Jan Orst. Slowly, Jan raised her face to meet Wexter's eyes. She saw frustration and annoyance in his gaze. Nice job, Ors, she thought. Now what? I'm waiting, Jan. Oh, come on, Ors. You've known Wexter too long to treat him like this. You owe him better than that. She took a deep breath, and some of the stiffness left her face as she spoke. I'm sorry, Wexter. I didn't mean for how I feel to affect you and Alessa. I'm mad at Kyle, not you. But why? Jan. Alessa said, her expression earnest, searching. What has Kyle done that you'd be this angry with him and treat him this poorly? Jan looked to her friend. I told you, Alessa. What he said about Galder. Oh, please? Jan, Alessa said, rolling her eyes. I've said worse things about him, and he's my brother. But Kyle doesn't even know him. It's not right for him to judge Galder like that. And I think he should apologize. Kyle, Alessa said, looking over her shoulder at him. Would you care to address that? Inside the lift, Kyle took a deep breath, wet his lips, and with determination, stepped from the lift. He moved past Alessa, stopping just behind where Wexter was standing. He looked to Jan, who was looking back at him expectantly, her arms crossed over her chest. Please let me say the right thing, he thought. Jan, he said, you're right. I don't know Galder well. It's been less than a day since I first met him. And despite what happened in the mess hall, I'm willing to accept Galder's apology and give him another chance. Jan felt the hard center of anger and frustration within her start to melt. Part of her lip curved upwards. Is that all you want to say? She asked. No, it's not, Kyle said, taking a step towards her. I want you to know that I'm sorry for the fight we had, and I hope you'll give me another chance. The melting in sight increased as Kyle smiled at her. She smiled back. Maybe things were going to take a turn for the better. Ahem. The two of them turned at the sound. Galder coughed into his hand once more, then looked to Kyle. Well spoken, Katarn. Thank you, Galder. That just leaves one unfinished item. Kyle's smile faded, his brows drawing together in confusion. Unfinished item. I don't understand. Well, you've apologized to Jan. I think you should apologize to me as well. As if an arc of energy had struck, Kyle, Wexter, and Alessa stared at Galder with thunderstruck expressions. Alessa was the first to speak. What are you playing at, Galder? Her brother looked at her with a serene expression. Nothing, Alessa. I'm being quite serious. Then explain why Kyle should apologize to you, Galder, Wexter said, looking intently at the younger man, because I don't see why. I think it's perfectly clear, Galder said. Kyle has admitted he judged me unfairly, having known me for only a short time. And I did apologize for my mistake in the mess hall. I think it only fair that he apologized to me. Watching this exchange, Kyle saw that his initial feeling about Galder had been correct. The man was a master manipulator, twisting words and situations to present himself blameless and others as the problem. And while he wasn't sure what the man's game was and what Jan had to do with it, he wasn't going to let Galder get away with it. Well, Kyle, Galder said, looking at him. Apologize to you, Kyle said, appearing to be considering it. All right, Galder. I'll apologize to you. Jan's smile grew wider, and Galder's expression was that of a predator ready to devour his prey. Forgive me, Jan, but I have to do this, Kyle continued. I'll apologize to you right around the time that the Hutts decide to abandon the spice trade and become humanitarians. Now it was Galder's turn to stay thunderstruck at Kyle. You did understand that, right? Or do I need to use smaller words? From his left, he heard Jan's angry shout. Kyle. Why you? Galder sputtered, his face flushed with anger. You. What? Kyle said, adding fuel to the fire. Rebel scum. Imperial traitor. Am I getting close? Balling his hand into fists, Galder took a step forward, intending to settle the matter physically. But when Kyle smiled at him, he stopped, feeling a bit unsure. Don't stop now, Galder, Kyle said. Go ahead and try it. Please? There was a sudden movement from his left. A heartbeat later, Jan was right in his face, her face nearly as red as Galder's. She interposed herself between the two men. What are you doing, Katarn? Leave him alone right now. You hear me? When Kyle didn't move, Jan took a step towards him. I said leave him alone. Back off right now, Katarn. Kyle's mind whirled. He was ready to take on Galder and settle this. But now Jan had stepped in, and she was furious. He took a step back, then another as she advanced again. Jan, he said calmly, stay out of this. Don't you dare tell me what to do, Kyle Katarn. I don't know how I could have thought that you were sincere a moment ago. Why are you acting like this? Galder apologized. Why can't you? Because, Jan, I didn't do anything wrong. He was the one who came after me in the mess hall, if you remember. How many more times are you going to bring that up? Galder made a mistake, he apologized for it, and it's done. Why are you attacking him? Kyle opened his mouth to speak, but Wexter jumped in. I think you should listen to him, Jan. Her face turned to the older man. How can you say that, Wexter? All Galder wants is a simple apology, and not only will Kyle not offer it, but now he's trying to goad Galder into a fight. Jan, Wexter said, his voice surprisingly calm. Think for a moment. Galder was in the wrong in the mess hall. And yes, he did apologize. But now, he's trying to make it look like Kyle did something wrong when he hasn't. What was said about Galder between you two has nothing to do with this. And before you forget, Kyle did apologize to you? I won't be talked about behind my back, Galder said from behind Jan. And you do owe me an apology, Katarn. You're right about me owing you something, Galder, Kyle said, taking a step forward. But it's not an apology. Kyle felt the pressure on his chest. He looked down to see Jan's head lying flat against him. He looked up just in time to catch the savage glare as she shoved him backwards. Caught off guard, Kyle stumbled back, nearly losing his balance. I told you to back off, Katarn, Jan said, pointing a finger at him. Later, Kyle would wonder if he should have backed off, but at the moment, he was too angry with Galder and Jan. Why don't you let your boyfriend fight his own battles, Jan? Come on, Galder, you too scared to fight me without your girlfriend. He expected Galder to react, but to his stunned surprise, it was Jan who moved. Moving like smoke, she didn't give him the time to even think about a defense. Shut up, Katarn. Pain, sudden and sharp, blossomed in Kyle's nose as Jan's fist smashed against it, the sharp crack of bone snapping audible to everyone. Losing his footing, Kyle fell back, hitting the deck hard. His back protested against the rough treatment even as his broken nose began to bleed, the white-hot spark of pain echoing in his mind. Then nothing. Jan! Cried Alessa, even as he darted forward, kneeling by Kyle's side. He wasn't moving. What have you done? Wexter said, moving to stand by Alessa.